Hi, I'm Seamless, and if I lean in real close like this, the camera actually keeps the light the right way. I will fix that one day. Yeah. Anyway, right now is a good time to talk about computer specs and what, are good ideas about designing a computer for producing and what my new computer actually is. People are asking about that a lot. My previous computer had an i7-3770 in it, which is like two entire generations away from current processor architectures. 3.2 gigahertz, I think. Might have just been straight 3 or maybe 3.5. Anyway, quad core, hyper threaded processor. I had 32 gigs of RAM, DDR3, and obviously, if you know anything about like our computer architecture, it might not be that obvious if that's not something you're into. It began its life with a GTX 670, and eventually I went up to a 770. And it had a 256 gigabyte SSD and two 512 gigabyte SSDs in RAID 0. Now, there's a lot of reasons for all that. Let's talk about my new computer just because see how kind of an incredible upgrade that was. My current computer has an i7 5820K, which is the lower end of the 6-core processors. There's the 5820K, 5830K, and 5860X or whatever. That's the 8-core $1,000 CPU. I've got the $380-ish one, which is still kind of a lot for a CPU, but it's reasonable. And I'll talk about the particular specifications about why I went with that one and not the more expensive 6-core CPU, since I'm obviously, perhaps not that obviously, but like I wanted to make a ridiculous computer. I wanted to spend a lot of money on just unbelievable computer. And I also am going big on the gaming side of things because I also got two GTX 980s. I currently only have one of them because I had to order them separately for bank reasons. But right at the moment, I'm doing just the one driving my Acer XB280HK G-Sync 4K monitor, which is just the greatest thing ever. I also have 64 gigabytes of DDR4 RAM at 2133 megahertz and 500 gigabyte SSD, and then the same terabyte of RAID 0 SSD, plus a big ass external hard drive that's like regular hard disk for just storing stuff, and that's it, I believe. In terms of, I also have a 1 terabyte external SSD. It's USB 3. It's really fast. That's how it works out. So let's talk about. Actually, I want to address why I went with the lower end, the 6-core, even though I wanted, ridiculous performance. I'm planning on overclocking my CPU. I got a Corsair H110i or H110i, which is a 280 millimeter water cooler. And water cooling has actually came really far since the last time I considered getting something like this, to the point where you can get reasonably like pretty excellent overclocking without like incredible amount of effort. I remember when the first time somebody broke 5 gigahertz on like a single core CPU with liquid nitrogen cooling was a big deal. And now when I overclock this, I'm probably going to push it to 4.5 gigahertz, and it's going to be great. And it won't even be hard. Like, I'll just go to the BIOS, voltage, end of story. Not really the end of story, but it's pretty easy. There's some guides online, right? So if you're going to be into that kind of stuff, I suggest you do that. But the thing is, it's not that important. It's pretty important, but it's not that important. And what I'm getting at is that for content creation, it's typically assumed that the programs are going to be really good at parallel processing, which is to say how good they are at taking advantage of multi-core CPUs. In gaming, that's usually not the case. It's usually their 4 cores is like what they're good at, but most of the time it's going to be a lot of single core loads because parallelism is hard, and making that work well is it's on the devs to make that work, and it's also on the OS to make that work. For the most part, Windows does a pretty good job of handling threads and distributing tasks and that kind of thing. But the devs still have to take advantage of that kind of stuff when they're developing things. If they don't do that, then it's not going to work out so well. Gaming typically does not, because they're usually, at least until this generation, they were confined to the consoles and hamstringed by whatever they were doing, which means that they were not really going to like be optimized for 8-core CPUs. For things like rendering, especially rendering. Rendering takes like linearly scalable improvement when you have multiple cores and that kind of thing. And FL does pretty good multi-threading wise, but there's a lot of stuff that if you know that you're doing it, it doesn't really necessarily work out. For example, Harmor, really good multi-threaded, has extremely good modern support for that kind of thing. Stick it in Patcher, and it becomes a single core load, because Patcher is not multi-threaded. A whole bunch of individual patchers will be a bunch of individually threaded things, but then the granularity of the threading is not going to maintain its granularity. So basically, like, you know, I was talking to Scott from ImageLine about this for a different person's computer, but the idea is not so much that you want more cores, is that you want faster cores. So the 6-core thing is a good idea because, again, rendering, that kind of thing. But then the reason why I went with the lowest one is because the difference between the $380 6-core CPU and the $580 or whatever 6-core CPU entirely is the limitation on PCIe lanes, where the one I have has 20 lanes and the other one has 40 lanes. And that's the $200 difference. That does matter for other stuff, like PCIe lanes are used for a lot of things, not just for PCIe stuff like video cards, but also other add-in things, like maybe if you have a sound card, like a PCIe, any kind of PCIe peripherals, but also modern stuff like the USB 3 connectivity either runs over that kind of stuff or is related to how that works out. M.2 ports will typically replace a PCIe like controller if it's active. You know, when USB 3 was new, there actually were motherboards where, like, if you used SLI, you lost your USB 3 kind of connection. So, like, that kind of stuff is why having a whole bunch of PCIe lanes matters. But I had mentioned that I was getting to GTX 980s. PCIe Express, when it's in full mode, is referred to as X16. That's to say how many lanes it's using. So if I were to use 2 of them, that's 32 lanes, which is more than 20. And this means that I would run one in X16 and one in X8, which actually sounds like a gigantic hamstring. And you're just saying, okay, cool, you're having the performance of one of them, and is that really better? And the answer to that question is actually, it is not what's happening at all. It's not about having the performance of the card. Well, it would be if the card were capable of fully saturating the X16 bandwidth, and it's not. Very few things are, and most things aren't. The things that are stuff like PCIe-based SSD peripherals, but even those are like X4. So that should give you an idea about how ridiculously fast and a full X16 Gen 3 PCIe connection is, and how absolutely not even close a regular video card like a 980 is to that kind of stuff. So it's not. I mean, there's actually been a very clear test to this that showed that there's not in any way an appreciable depreciation of the power between the 20 lane and the 40 lane ones. That's why I went with the 20 lane one. It's also, I mean, so it's smart, you know, it's cheaper, and you can just overclock it to be as fast or faster than the other ones, so it's like you save money. And while I did want to, you know, have a ridiculous expensive computer, I also didn't want to have needlessly expensive stuff. There were some needlessly expensive stuff though, because DDR4 is not exactly as cheap as DDR3 is, and I went for 64 gigabytes of it, which is like an astounding amount of overkill. Just about everybody who is producing the kind of music that you're going to find my tutorials to even have anything to do with is producing stuff that probably will never use more than 16 gigs of RAM. You barely will use more than 8. Like, Windows might use a whole bunch, but what your project is going to do is probably not even going to approach that. If you're doing, you know, really incredible, like, you know, band recording projects with like, you know, 1,000 channels of drums, that might be a thing. But even that, a lot of programs prioritize RAM usage. Like Reaper has settings in there where it'll automatically cut off and save files once you reach a gigabyte of RAM usage per file, so that, like, you know, you don't use all your RAM. And RAM in general, there's also been a bunch of tests about, like, really, really fast RAM, because you can overclock RAM too, and while there is a little bit of an increase in performance, it's not actually that much. But I did get 64 gigabytes of it, and that's because, like, if I have that kind of capability, I will be tempted to actually use it, which means I will push stuff to limits and that kind of thing. But I honestly don't need that, especially since I favor synthesis over sample usage pretty much all the time, except for when I'm doing, you know, orchestra stuff or whatever. But even that doesn't use basically any RAM at all, and that's because of what I'm doing with the SSDs. SSDs, if you're not familiar, stands for solid state drive, as opposed to HDD, which stands for hard disk drive. Hard disk drives have actual like disks that spin around really fast, platters with stacks, and has a little arm that runs around and reads it, and it's a very mechanical, very physical process about reading and writing data. That is an incredible limitation for a huge number of reasons. SSDs are basically RAM on a SATA port that you're plugging in, and it's flash memory. It's the same technology. And so that means it's on immediately. It requires no physical contact of anything whatsoever, and it's unbelievably fast. Like, it's stupidly fast. And I mentioned RAID 0. RAID is a whole bunch of different setups you could have for multiple hard drives to work in tandem to do a bunch of different things. You could do stuff like automatically copy a drive whenever you write on a drive, so that you have an automatic backup in case your drive fails. You have that idea, basically different combinations of that idea and combinations of what RAID 0 is, which is it writes to both drives at once as if they were one drive. So like if I had a piece of data, half of it goes on one drive, half of it goes on the other drive, writes on that simultaneously on two different connections, and you get twice the speed. So if you have SSDs, which are really goddamn fast, you put them together in RAID 0, it becomes twice as goddamn fast. And the purpose of this, the entire reason I did that on the original build, was for my usage of the East-West stuff, the East-West Quantum Leap, so like the orchestra, the choirs, any of the samples that they utilize. And this is because East-West, by default, does not store their instruments in RAM. It stores stuff on the hard drive, and then it streams it from the hard drive, which, in theory, is actually really awesome because their libraries are gargantuan. Like, the piano library that I like to use, the Bossendorfer 290 from East-West Pianos, if I were to load the entire master patch, the full-on, all the articulations, everything to go, it would be 33 gigabytes for that patch. That's how big these fucking libraries are. And so it's just like... And this particular library has existed for a very long time, long before having this amount of RAM was even possible on consumer-grade hardware. And not to mention, they just came out with 16 gig sticks of RAM. The Corsair makes 16 gig sticks of RAM, which means I could have had, if I build it now, if I really wanted to go hardcore, I could have had 128 gigs of RAM on my X99 motherboard. How stupid is that? At what point whatever. Anyway, so... the problem with that, though, with the East-West stuff, is that hard drives typically are not very fast, which means if I use a whole bunch of instruments, the bottleneck becomes really obvious, and it's really the hard drive, and it becomes a big, big problem. So, like, RAID arrays usually were, like, the preferred method of doing that, but then SSDs came around, and then SSD RAID, that's, like, it's really fast. Like, the bottleneck is just gone at that point. So, like, I really have that terabyte of SSD storage in RAID 0, which at the time cost me $800 specifically so that I could have basically unlimited East-West stuff with full performance and at, like, you know, live, real time, and not have to worry about stuff. Because East-West, along with that, had a lot of other problems, which they have honestly since fixed to the point where it's actually there's no problems with the stuff. It's just really good. And that kind of thing. Contact, I think, has an option for that kind of stuff as well, but for the most part, their libraries are more reasonably sized to the point where loading in the RAM won't end your life. So yeah. Anyway, those are the decisions that I made in the creation of my rig. However, I hoped in discussing that I also outlined how ridiculous my rig is and how not normal it is for people to require such a just stupid amount of stuff. Like real professionals, people who are like not the YouTuber tutorial kind of guy that I am, but like, you know, make the music and do the stuff that everyone wants to know how to make that I end up teaching. They don't have computer hardware that's even a little bit as ridiculous as what I have right now. And it's not because they can't have it, it's because they don't need it. And so, like, people are talking about, like, oh, what's a good computer, like, you know, maximizing for performance and, you know, or, well, for producing and that kind of thing. Like, a quad-core CPU, reasonably fast, is fine. 16 gigs of RAM, fine. Reasonably fast hard drive, fine. Like, if you want to go hard, an SSD, but even SSDs are not even that expensive anymore, and they're honestly, like, once you start using an SSD, regular hard drives just seem stupid. They do. They're like, they're like 20 times faster than a normal hard drive. So loading samples, saving things, saving projects, loading projects, all that stuff happens immediately, as opposed to, and like before I got an SSD, yeah, this is stuff I'm just used to, like, how slow stuff is, because that's just how fast it is. In fact, I might have even thought that it was fast before I had an SSD. This was around when they actually first introduced the SATA 6 gigabyte per second, 6 gigabit per second, gigabit per second port, and like regular hard drives got like a normal, pretty okay boost from that, but. Like, so I was like, oh, everything is fast, everything is really amazing. And then I got an SSD, and I noticed that when you upgrade stuff, just like this 4K monitor that I have, when you upgrade stuff, when you start using the upgraded stuff, most of the time it's not immediately obvious how impressive it is. And the thing that really drives it home about how impressive the new thing is when you, for some reason, have to go use the old thing. And then you go, oh my god, this is so bad. For a 4K monitor, it was a lot like that. Like, the 4K monitor, like, the first thing that struck me was how unbelievably tiny everything was by default, because the resolution is 4 times that of 1080p. And, like, once I dealt with that and got the scaling down, and I got all that set up, it seemed pretty normal and regular. I got used to it really freaking fast. And then I went to my old computer, the old 1080p computer, so that I could, like, get files off of it. And, like, I felt like I was using a 640x480 monitor from fucking CRT ages and the 90s. And I was just like, it felt like the pixels were 16 times bigger than everything I've ever seen in my life. Because on my 4K monitor, I legit cannot see the pixels unless I, like, get up in there. And versus the 1080p monitor, I'm looking at it, I can, like, count them. It's like, that's what I was like with the hard drive, where anytime at all that I have to access my external archival disk to do anything, and it takes longer than immediately, I feel like I'm dying. That's how fast SSDs are. And so, like, the relatively extreme solution I use to even use the East-West stuff is because I don't like doing things like bouncing audio. Like, that's like that's the kind of stuff that, like, every producer is used to doing that. You just do that. Like, somebody on Facebook actually asked me a question about how can they get audio to behave like a synth, because they can't have so many instances of massive writing, so they record a patch and they don't want it to speed up, because that's how audio works. And it didn't even occur to me that anyone would ever have a problem just running a synth. And, like, honestly, it's not just me being like, I've been using supercomputers my whole life. It's just that, like, once upon a time, I had a laptop with a Core i3 in it, like the first generation i series, when they started even calling it that. And I was really impressed with how well it could run FL, how well I could just do stuff with it, and then it wasn't even a big deal. Up until that point, I had been using mostly AMD CPUs, so this was, like, quite a shock to me that, like, the lowest end Intel CPU was performing about as good as my relatively high-end AMD quad-core, which was a big deal back in the day. And, like, I actually think it was a dual core, but the point being, this kind of stuff is not really that intense. It's not like video editing, which is literally like adding a new dimension to this kind of stuff, which adds just an incredible amount of processing and movement and storage and all that kind of stuff versus the audio stuff. The audio stuff can get up in there, but for the most part, when it does, you just bounce the stuff and you don't need to worry about it. Or, in Ableton, you have freezing, and in AFL, you do have freezing, but I totally admit that it's not, like, super obvious and amazing in comparison. But the point being, you don't need to have a $10,000 computer. This wasn't a $10,000 computer. This was like a $3,500 computer. A lot of, like, the actual tower, well, it's not really a tower, it's like a cube, but the cube was about $3,500 with all the ridiculous bells and whistles, which honestly isn't that much for, like, a workstation computer. And if I wasn't trying to be frivolous, like, if I stuck with 32 gigs, if I didn't get ridiculous video cards, I would have to have struggled to make this a $2,000 computer. So, like, technology is really goddamn good these days. A lot. It's really a lot good. Yeah, SSDs are amazing. 4K is amazing. But yeah, I hope that weird little rant spiel thing explains some things about computers to people. As it turns out, for a lot of purposes, good gaming computers make pretty good production workstation computers. A lot of the things that matter still matter for the two of them, especially if you're doing video editing, because video cards these days usually have secondary abilities to process things like Adobe Premiere or After Effects in ways that are definitely very much helped by the presence of these particular video cards. Not so much for audio stuff, but like it's just at more than average CPU cores for audio editing. And I just I want to play Shadow of Mordor at 4K at 60 FPS. Such is life. Anyway, if you have any questions about this, please let me know. And as usual, have a nice day.